Sometimes you spend half your life believing you were unwanted, only to discover you were the most protected person in the room. My name is Claire Dennison, I'm 34 years old, and the last thing my father ever said to me was leave. I was 12, standing in the driveway with a backpack while my uncle's headlights cut through the Idaho dust. My father wouldn't turn around. For 22 years, I carried that moment like a scar. I believed he discarded me, so I built a life around never needing anyone again. Then last September, my phone lit up during a rare long weekend in Sedona. Come home, don't tell your mother you're coming. I almost deleted it. My mother hadn't been a mother in over 2 decades, but the second message used a name I hadn't heard in years, and my stomach dropped. I flew out that night. At the airport, a woman in a gray blazer and 2 county investigators were waiting at baggage claim. What they told me in that fluorescent hallway made my knees give out. The cruelest thing my father ever did turned out to be the kindest, and what my mother did in response is the part that still makes my hands shake. Let me back up. I'm a soil engineer now. I work on failing dam sites and contaminated land remediation, places where the ground has given way and someone needs to figure out why. It suits me. I'm good at reading what's beneath the surface, good at staying calm when everything is collapsing. Most of my work happens alone. I live in a small apartment in Bozeman with no photos on the walls. I've gotten used to that. The weekend before all this, I'd been in Eastern Oregon documenting a slope failure for a legal case. Quiet work, clinical, I like it that way. My Uncle Ben, my father's younger brother, had insisted I take a few days off. He'd rented a place in Sedona for his kids and their families. I went because Ben had raised me when no one else would, and I owed him that. On the third night, one of his grandkids asked me, innocent as anything, if I'd ever been back to the ranch, the one in the old photos on Ben's mantle. The conversation on the porch stuttered. Ben set down his beer too carefully. He got a look I'd only seen twice before, tight around the eyes, like a man bracing against wind. Don't fill her head with that place, he said. Then he changed the subject. I let it go. I was good at letting things go. But I noticed him watching me later while I washed dishes. The way you watch someone you're afraid is about to learn something. I poured a glass of wine and walked out to the desert edge to watch the sun drop behind the red rocks. My phone buzzed. I thought it was work. It wasn't. Come home, don't tell your mother you're coming. I read it 3 times. The air smelled like sage and warm stone, and just like that, I was 12 again. Funny how a smell does that. The night they sent me away, the ranch smelled like cut hay, sweet and grassy under a sky gone violet. I'd come downstairs for water and found my mother and her brother Kyle at the kitchen table. Papers spread everywhere. I didn't know it then, but they were my grandmother's bank statements. Kyle saw me in the doorway. His face went cold. He leaned toward my father, who'd just come in from the barn, and said quietly, "The kid saw." My father's face drained. Nobody explained anything. By morning, my bag was packed. My mother stood on the porch with her arms folded while Ben's truck came up the gravel drive. I asked her why I had to leave. She looked at me with something like pity. He doesn't want you here, Claire. We tried. It didn't work out. My father stood by the fence in his canvas work jacket. He wouldn't look at me, not when I said his name, not when I started crying. The only word he said was, leave. So I did. For 22 years, I believed what my mother told me, because a 12-year-old believes her mother, and because no one, not one person, ever called to tell me otherwise. Until now. I'm not the type to jump because a stranger texts me. I called the number back, generic voicemail. I ran a reverse lookup, got an Idaho area code, nothing else. I sat on the cool stone and thought it through like I'd think through a site failure. Someone knew my number, knew I was traveling, knew the word mother would mean something specific. This wasn't random. I texted back, "Who is this?" The reply came fast. "It's about your father. Your mother and Kyle can't know you're coming." Reading Kyle's name from a stranger did something to the back of my neck that 2 decades of distance hadn't undone. This wasn't a prank. I stood up, brushed off the dust, and booked a red-eye to Boise. On the plane, I did the math. Here's what the town of Lewiston, Idaho, had been told about Claire Dennison: that I was a troubled kid, a liar, that my parents had tried everything, and finally, for everyone's sake, they'd sent me to live with my uncle. I knew the story because I'd gone back once at 19, stood in the hardware store and watched adults change aisles to avoid me. I didn't argue. I'd learned young that you can't talk someone out of a conclusion they've chosen because it's comfortable. So I stopped trying to win people over, and I got very, very good at something they couldn't take from me. I put myself through school, built a reputation in 3 states for solid work and honest invoicing. Let them keep their story. I had a better one. What I didn't know, sipping bad airport coffee at 2 in the morning, was what was actually waiting for me. The ranch was 600 acres of high desert and creek bottom that had been in the family since 1928. My grandmother, Iris Dennison, had controlled it until she passed 4 years ago. I hadn't even been told she died. Somewhere in Idaho, there was a will, and estate, a whole accounting of who got what. And someone with 2 county investigators thought I needed to know about it badly enough to fly me across the country in the middle of the night. Before I let anyone steer me, I tested it. From the Boise gate at 6 a.m., I dialed the ranch landline, the number I'd memorized as a kid and never used since. It rang 4 times. Then a recording, my mother's voice, older and flatter than I remembered. "You've reached Diane and Kyle at the Dennison residence. Leave a message." Kyle, living in my grandmother's house. That told me more than the stranger had. I hung up before the beep. If my mother and her brother were running that place together, and someone official wanted me there without them knowing, then the warning wasn't paranoia. It was a map. The man waiting at baggage claim wore a gray suit and held a folder against his chest like a shield. 2 people in county jackets stood a careful distance behind him. He found me immediately, which meant he had a photo, which meant this had been planned. "Miss Dennison," he said. His voice was kind in the careful way doctors use before bad news. His name was Robert Calloway. He'd been my father's attorney for 18 years, though I'd never heard of him. The 2 behind him were investigators with the county prosecutor's office. We sat in a glass-walled airline office someone had unlocked for us, fluorescent lights, fake plant, a clock that ticked too loud. Robert set the folder on the table and folded his hands on top of it. "Before I say the rest," he told me, "I need you to hear one thing clearly. Your father did not send you away, Miss Dennison." I sat very still. 22 years is a long time to hold a sentence in your body. "What do you mean?" I kept my voice level. "It's the only religion I've ever practiced." He opened the folder. On top was a single envelope, cream-colored, soft at the corners from handling. Across the front, in handwriting I hadn't seen since I was a girl but knew the way you know your own heartbeat, was my name. Claire. My father's hand, the pen pressed so hard in places it had nearly torn the paper. Robert slid it toward me. I didn't pick it up. The clock ticked. Then he said the next thing gently, the way you'd set down something fragile. "Your father passed 6 days ago. He left everything to you, and 22 years ago, he sent you away to keep you safe." I got about as far as the word safe. Then my knees stopped being mine, and the floor came up, and the world went to white noise. I want to be clear about why. I didn't faint from weakness. I'd flown all night on an empty stomach and 2 coffees, and a stranger had just told me that the father I'd spent 22 years resenting had loved me the entire time and was now in the ground where I could never reach him. That's not weakness. That's grief arriving all at once with nowhere to go. When I came up, one of the investigators was crouched beside me with a paper cup of water, saying my name softly. Robert looked stricken. I pushed the cup away and got my back against the wall. "First time," I said, my voice came out rough. "My crew would never let me live it down." Nobody laughed. "Fair." I breathed until the room held still. Then I did the only thing I know how to do when everything is falling apart. I reached for the next solid fact. "I don't want the water," I said. "I want the file. Start at the beginning. Don't soften any of it." Robert poured himself some of the water I'd refused. The text was his, sent from a prepaid phone he'd bought for exactly this purpose. The warning about my mother wasn't metaphor. My mother, Diane, and my uncle Kyle were the subjects of an open investigation. If either of them learned I was in the state before the right pieces were in place, the careful structure my father had built over 22 years could collapse in an afternoon. They could move money, pressure people, destroy records. "Kyle," Robert said carefully, "has a history of making people reconsider their statements." The investigators didn't contradict him. "An investigation into what?" I asked. The woman investigator, Detective Marianne Holt, took it from there. "Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, your grandmother, Iris Dennison." I felt the floor tilt again. I planted both feet. Iris had been the one warm adult of my early childhood, the one who let me name the barn cats and taught me to make biscuits. "They drained her," Holt said plainly, "over years, powers of attorney, signatures, accounts. We've had pieces of it for a long time, we haven't had all of it." I looked at the folder, then at the envelope with my name in my father's desperate hand. Something in me that had been curled tight for 22 years started, very slowly, to stand. "Keep going," I said. "How long did my father know?" Robert and Detective Holt traded a look. Robert spread the documents across the table. I read them the way I read a soil report, top to bottom, looking for the thing that doesn't fit. Withdrawals from Iris's accounts going back 12 years. A power of attorney she'd signed when her eyesight was failing, with Kyle as agent and my mother as successor. Transfers, even amounts, the kind designed not to trip a bank's attention. $230,000, gone in pieces. I have a clinical mind, it's the only thing that let me stay upright. But on the third page, my memory snagged on a line and wouldn't let go. A single large withdrawal, $15,000, dated July 22nd. The summer I was 12. Detective Holt, I said slowly, July 22nd, that was my grandmother's birthday. We were all at the house that night. I came downstairs and saw my mother and Kyle at the kitchen table with her bank papers, and Kyle said, "The kid saw," and the next morning, I was gone. Holt went very still. She pulled the page closer. "You've had this record for how long?" "About 14 months, she admitted. "You had the number and the date, you didn't have the only person standing in that kitchen." For the first time, both of them looked at me not as a grieving daughter to be managed, but as something useful. A witness. Robert closed his eyes a moment. "Your father knew," he said quietly. "He knew before you were 12, he just couldn't prove it yet, and he couldn't protect you and fight them at the same time. I want to tell you I melted into gratitude right there. I didn't. I got angry, the clean, useful kind. If he knew," I said, "then explain something to me. He knew I was in danger from his own wife, so he sent me to Ben and went radio silent for 22 years, no letters, no birthday calls. He let me grow up certain he didn't want me, so which was it? Was I his daughter, or just a problem he filed away so it wouldn't mess up whatever long game he was playing?" The investigators looked at the table. Robert didn't. "Your father told me you'd ask that," he said, word for word. He said, "Claire's too smart to be bought with a sad story, so don't try. There's a letter. She gets it when I'm gone and the pieces are in place to keep her safe, not one day sooner. If I let her open it while I'm alive, I'll lose my nerve and ruin 22 years of work, because the second I see my girl's face, I'll tell her everything and damn the consequences." I sat there with my jaw tight. I didn't trust a dead man's words yet. But I wanted to read them more than I'd wanted anything in a long time. Ben was already driving to Boise. That was the part that gutted me. He'd been on a flight an hour behind mine, because Robert had called him the moment I texted back, and he hadn't said one word to me on that porch in Sedona. When he walked into the airline office, 62 years old and gray and shaking, I stood up so fast my chair scraped. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. He didn't look away. "I knew," he said. "Your father came to me the week before he put you in my truck. He told me what Diane and Kyle were doing, and he made me swear on our mother that I would never tell you the real reason. He said if you knew, you'd come back to fix it, the way you fix everything, and they'd hurt you to keep you quiet. He said the only way to keep you safe was to make sure you wanted nothing to do with this place." His voice dropped. "He tried once, that first Christmas. He couldn't stand it. He gave me a card to mail you, just his name inside, nothing else." 2 weeks later, Kyle cornered him by the grain bins and said, real friendly, that it was a shame about the girl, all the way out at Ben's place in Montana. "He used your name. Your father had told no living soul where you were but me. After that, he never sent another word, because now he knew for certain they were watching." Ben set a box on the table between us, a plain cardboard file box, taped at the seams. On top of it, folded, was the canvas work jacket my father had worn the last morning I saw him. I hadn't seen that jacket in 22 years, and I would have known it in the dark. "He wanted you to have this," Ben said. "He told me, when she opens it, make sure she's alone. She's going to need to be the only one in the room." I put my hand flat on the jacket. It still smelled, faintly, impossibly, of him. I took the box to a motel by the interstate and locked the door. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, the way I used to sit as a kid when the world got too big. Inside were two things, a thick binder, and the cream envelope with my name. I opened the envelope first. The letter ran 14 pages, dated across years like a logbook, my father's hard pen softening and shaking toward the end. He wrote about the night I came downstairs. He wrote that Kyle had threatened, in plain words, to make sure the kid forgets what she thinks she saw, that he'd looked at his 12-year-old daughter and understood he couldn't both protect me and gather the proof to stop them. So he chose. He sent me out of their reach and spent the next 22 years quietly building the case I couldn't have helped him build. Near the bottom of the first page was a line I've read so many times I could recite it in my sleep. "I had to let you hate me to keep you alive." The binder was the proof. Not a diary, not some secret recording, real paper, the kind that holds up in court. Certified bank statements he'd subpoenaed through a guardianship petition, a copy of a beneficiary deed on the 600 acres, signed and recorded at the county courthouse in 2017, naming me, correspondence with Detective Holt's office going back 3 years. A revocable trust holding what was left of Iris's money, with my name on it. My father hadn't loved me out loud. He'd loved me in filings, in recordings, in 22 years of letting me be furious so that I would be far away and breathing. I sat on that motel floor and cried the way you cry once a decade. If you've ever lost years with someone because of a lie somebody else told, comment the word home below. I read the whole letter twice that night. The second time, the night I was 12, rearranged itself in front of me. The bank papers on the table had been Iris's, and I'd walked into the middle of a theft. Kyle's cold face, the words, "the kid saw." My father coming in from the barn, still smelling of hay, going gray when he understood that his child had become a loose end. He had a choice no parent should have to make: keep me close, or keep me safe. And he made the one that cost him everything he wanted and gave me everything I needed. He couldn't look at me by the fence because if he had, the letter said, he wouldn't have been able to do it. He would have pulled me back inside and held the line right there, and they would have come for us both. So he kept his back turned and let the porch door slam and said the one word he could get out without breaking. Leave. For 22 years, I'd heard that word as rejection. Now I heard it as the hardest act of love a tired man ever managed. The letter answered the questions I'd been throwing at Robert, the ones any sane person would ask. Why no secret calls? Why no letters slipped through Ben? My father had thought through every door and written down why each one was closed. Kyle still went through Iris's mail, watched the family like a hawk watches a fence line. One card from my father to a daughter he was supposed to have disowned would have told them the witness still mattered to him, and they'd have come looking to make sure I stayed quiet. A real estrangement was the only kind that held up under that kind of watching. And I understood, reading it twice, what Kyle had actually wanted all those years. Not to chase me down. A vanished girl brings deputies and questions, a hurt one brings worse. The last thing two people skimming an old woman's accounts could afford was anybody asking where the granddaughter went. Kyle needed me gone and silent, nothing more. And for 22 years, I obligingly was both. The danger was never a hunt, it was a door, and it only swung open if I came back, or learned the truth, or opened my mouth. Kyle's friendly little comment by the grain bins hadn't been a slip, it had been the whole message: we know where she is, keep her gone and she stays fine. My father heard it for exactly what it was. And he kept me behind that door for 2 decades. It didn't fix the grief. Nothing fixes the grief of finding out a person loved you only after they're too far gone to tell. But it turned the anger toward the people who'd earned it. My mother, who had stood on that porch and looked her crying daughter in the eye and chosen the cruelest possible lie. Her brother, who had made my own father afraid for my life. They were 40 miles south of that motel, sleeping in my grandmother's house, counting an inheritance they believed was theirs. They had no idea I'd come home. In the morning, I met Robert at his office in Lewiston. He laid out where things stood. My father's funeral had been small and fast, the way Diane wanted it, before anyone could ask questions. The reading of the will was set for Friday at the ranch house, 3 days out. My mother had insisted on the house, in front of family, the pastor, a couple of longtime neighbors, because Diane Dennison never met an audience she didn't want to perform for. She believed she was inheriting 600 acres and whatever Iris had left. She'd already had a lawyer of her own draft paperwork to that effect. Robert slid a document across his desk. 3 weeks before your father died, he said, your mother had him sign what she told the notary was a renewal of a grazing lease. It was actually a quitclaim deed, transferring the land to her. I felt my pulse pick up. I made it slow back down. Did it work? I asked. He almost smiled. No, you can't give away what you don't own anymore. Your father recorded that beneficiary deed to you back in 2017. A recorded deed like that controls the land at death, no matter what a later piece of paper says, and no matter what's in any will. She tried to steal a ranch he'd already given away. She just doesn't know it yet. I sat with that. I could have stayed in Montana and let the lawyers handle it by mail, never set foot in that house again. That would have been the safe choice. And the small one. Put me on the list for Friday, I said. I want to be in that room. I didn't wait for Friday to lay eyes on them. I drove out to the ranch Wednesday afternoon, down the county road I hadn't traveled since I was 19. The fields were in late-season irrigation, and the air smelled like wet sage and cut alfalfa, that same sweet green smell rolling through the truck windows and straight into the oldest part of me. The house looked smaller and meaner than my memory. My mother came out onto the porch before I was out of the truck. 22 years fell away in the worst way. She'd aged into a hard, handsome woman who held her grief like a prop, Diane Dennison in black, dabbing at dry eyes. Well, she said, look what the wind blew in. Kyle came to the door behind her, heavier, grayer, same flat eyes. Travis was there too, my half-brother, 29 now. a man I'd never really known, raised entirely on the story that I was the bad seed. I told my mother I'd come for my father's service, to pay respects. And I watched her decide I was harmless. She softened into something worse than hostility, a kind of pity. "Honey," she said, "you came a long way for a man who shipped you off and never looked back. You always did make everything about you." And then, because she couldn't help herself, because cruelty was the one language she was truly fluent in, she said it again, the sentence she'd branded me with on this very porch. "He didn't want you, Claire. We tried. It didn't work out." I stood in the yard with the alfalfa smell all around me and my father's case sitting in a binder in my truck, and I didn't say a word about any of it. I just looked at her, calm as a frozen pond. "Friday," she said, "you can come hear the will, and then go on back to your dirt samples." I said I wouldn't miss it for the world. Travis followed me out to my truck. He was twitchy, a man who'd been promised something and was watching the promise get complicated. "You shouldn't have come," he said, not unkind, just nervous. "Mom and Kyle have got it all settled, the land, Grandma's accounts, all of it. There's papers." "What papers?" I asked. He told me, with the confidence of a man repeating what he'd been fed, that 3 weeks before Dad died, he'd signed the ranch over to Mom, free and clear, that a lawyer in Coeur d'Alene had it locked up tight. I kept my face still. So that was the quitclaim Robert had described, the one my mother thought was a winning hand. They weren't bluffing because they were lying. They were bluffing because they genuinely believed they'd already won. That was useful. A person who thinks they've won gets careless. They say things out loud that a careful person would never say. I asked Travis gently whether he'd ever actually seen the things Mom said I did as a kid, the stealing, the lies. He blinked. "Well, no," he said. "I was little, but she told me." He stopped, like a man who'd heard his own sentence from the outside for the first time. I let it sit. I didn't push. "You plant the seed, you let the rain do the rest." "I'll see you Friday," I said. I drove back to town with the windows down. And for the first time since Sedona, I felt something other than grief. I felt the cold, clean focus I get right before a hard procedure, when I already know exactly where the trouble is and exactly what my hands are going to do about it. That afternoon, Robert walked me through exactly what I had and exactly what I didn't. Because false hope is just a slower kind of cruelty. What I had was strong. The recorded beneficiary deed meant the 600 acres were set to pass to me at my father's death, ahead of the will, and ahead of my mother's clumsy quitclaim. The trust held what was left of Iris's money in my name. Those weren't promises, those were filed, stamped, time-stamped facts, set in motion back in 2017, long before my mother made her move. Robert wouldn't let me mistake strong for untouchable. "She can still come after the deed itself," he said, "if she can convince a judge your father lacked capacity in 2017, or was unduly influenced." He didn't think it would land, given the date and how clearly my father had documented everything while he was sharp and healthy. But a fight was a fight, and judges were human. Besides, as my father's surviving spouse, my mother had a right under Idaho law to claim an elective share of his estate, a slice she couldn't be entirely cut out of. She would fight, she would hire someone good, and she would drag it out. The land, though, the heart of it, the thing my father had spent 22 years protecting, sat on the strongest footing the law gives a person. And Robert said so, in exactly those words. Then he made me hear the rest of the sentence. "Strongest isn't certain. With a marriage this long and a ranch worth this much, she can make it slow and ugly and expensive. You should expect a year, maybe 2, of lawyers before a court puts it to bed." He believed the deed would hold. He wouldn't promise me it would hold easy. My father hadn't won the war in advance. He'd handed me the best hand at the table and the burden of playing it out. He'd filed the boring paperwork that nobody dramatic ever bothers with. And the boring paperwork is what holds when everything else burns. Kyle found me Thursday evening behind the equipment shed, where I'd walked to look at the old disc harrow my father used to let me ride. I heard his boots on the gravel before I saw him. The back of my neck did the thing it had done at 12. He stopped close, too close, the way a man does when the point is to make you feel small. "You're stirring something up," he said. "I can smell it on you." I told him I was here for a funeral. He smiled without any warmth in it. "Let me give you some family advice, girl. This family eats people who come back. Your dad learned to keep his mouth shut. You should think about doing the same, and getting on a plane." 22 years ago, that voice had put me in a car to another state. Standing there at 34, I understood finally and completely the exact fear my father had carried, and why he'd made the choice he made. I didn't back up. I also didn't pretend I was bigger than I am. I took one step to the side, out of his reach, and I looked at my watch. I noted the time out loud so he would see me do it. 5:47, Thursday. I said, "You just threatened me behind the shed. I'm a witness in an active investigation, Kyle, and from this minute, everything you say to me goes in a statement." He went still. That was the moment the power started to move. And we both felt it. He could threaten me with his body, the way he always had. I could answer with a date, a time, and a detective's phone number. Those aren't the same weapon. And mine was the one that doesn't wear out. I called Detective Holt from the truck and reported it before I even left the driveway. She told me the investigation had moved further than anyone in that house suspected. The bank had flagged the pattern. The guardianship file my father started was now in evidence. My identification of the July 22 withdrawal, tied to the night I was sent away, had given them the human thread they'd been missing. The thing that turns a spreadsheet into a story a jury understands. Diane and Kyle still thought they were managing a will reading. They had no idea a county prosecutor was reading the same pages as I was. That night, Travis called me. He didn't say much. He asked one thing, in a small voice that didn't match his size. "Did Dad really write you a letter?" I told him yes. He was quiet a long time. Then he asked what it said. I read him 3 lines, the ones about why our father turned his back. On the other end of the line, my brother, who'd spent his whole life being handed our mother's version of me, started to breathe wrong, the way men do when they won't let themselves cry. He didn't apologize, he didn't switch sides. But something in him came loose that night. And I let it. Because the truth does its own work if you just give it air and get out of the way. Thursday night, I sat down with Robert and told him how Friday was going to go. Because I wasn't going to be a passenger at my own reckoning. Most people in my position would let the lawyer stand up and read the deed and let the facts land. I wanted more than facts. I wanted the truth and the lie in the same room at the same time, so nobody in that house could ever again pretend they didn't see it. Here's what I told him: don't lead with the deed, let my mother run the room first. Let her stand up in front of the pastor and the neighbors and tell the whole story she's been telling for 22 years. That Dad sent me away because I was a thief and a liar. That she's the loyal widow inheriting what's rightfully hers. Let her commit to all of it out loud, in front of witnesses. And only then, when she's nailed every word to the wall, you open the folder. Robert looked at me for a long moment. "That's not how I usually do a reading," he said. "I know," I told him, "but you've been doing the safe version for 22 years, and she's still standing on that porch. I'm not asking her to confess. I'm giving her the chance to perform the lie one last time in front of every person whose opinion she's ever cared about, and then I'm going to hand her the paper." He sat back. "Your father," he said quietly, "would have loved this. He was a patient man, too." Friday came gray and warm, with second cutting alfalfa heavy on the air. I put on the only black dress I owned and drove out to the farmhouse to give my mother exactly enough rope. The front room was set up like a stage. Which is to say, like my mother. Folding chairs in rows, the good lamp on, the pastor in the front, 2 gray neighbors I half remembered, Ben in the back with his hands knotted in his lap, Travis against the wall by the window, and Kyle, planted by the door like a guard. Diane sat in the center in her black dress, chin up, a widow at her coronation. Robert took the chair at the front with his folder closed. I sat off to the side where I could see every face. My mother opened it herself, of course. She didn't wait for the lawyer. She rose and turned to the pastor and the neighbors and began, in a voice trembling with rehearsed sorrow, to tell them all how hard her marriage had been, how she'd stood by my father through everything, including the terrible burden of a daughter who lied and stole and had to be sent away for the family's own safety. She gestured at me without quite looking at me. "We did everything we could for that girl," she told the room, "and she repaid us by breaking her father's heart, and now she has the gall to come back when there's money on the table." The neighbors nodded, soft with sympathy. The pastor patted her hand. She was magnificent, in the way a wildfire is magnificent. And she had no idea she was standing in her own kerosene. When she finally sat, satisfied, certain she'd set the table the way she always did, she nodded at Robert to get on with handing her the kingdom. Behind me, the screen door, which had been propped, swung loose in the warm air and creaked. Detective Holt and her partner stepped quietly into the back of the room. Nobody but me seemed to notice. I looked at Robert. I gave him the smallest nod. He opened the folder. And I watched my mother's face. Because I'd waited 22 years for what was about to cross it. Robert didn't raise his voice, he never does. He simply read what was recorded. That on March 11, 2017, my father executed and recorded a beneficiary deed conveying all 600 acres of the Dennison Ranch to his daughter, Claire Dennison, effective at his death. That the deed controlled the land regardless of any will or any later transfer. That a revocable trust held the remaining funds of Iris Dennison, also in my name. That the quitclaim deed Diane had obtained 3 weeks before my father's death conveyed nothing, because by then, my father owned nothing left to give. The room didn't erupt all at once. It came in stages, like ice going out on a river. The neighbors turned to look at me, then at Diane. The pastor's hand went still on hers. And my mother stood up so fast her chair went over backward. And the performance fell off her face all the way down to the bone. "This is fraud," she said. Her voice cracked up into a register I'd never heard from her. He was sick. He didn't know what he was signing. That girl manipulated a dying man. Kyle came off the door with his fists working. And I sat there, hands folded in my lap, and I let her burn, because the only person in that room who needed to stay calm was me. When she finally ran out of air, I spoke once, quietly. And the whole room leaned in to hear it. "He didn't send me away," I said. "He sent me out of reach. There's a difference. And you spent 22 years making sure I never learned it." She started to answer, and I kept going, still soft, looking right at her. "You told me on that porch that he didn't want me. You told me we tried and it didn't work out. He spent the next 22 years proving you wrong, on paper, in a courthouse, with his name pressed so hard into the deed it nearly tore the page." Then she changed tactics, the way drowning people do. She came toward me with her hands out and her voice gone sweet and shaking. "We can work this out," she said, "family to family, we'll split it fair, just you and me, no lawyers, no police." For 1 second, I saw the frightened poor girl she must have been once, the one who swore she'd never be powerless again. And I almost felt the pull of it. Then it passed. "There's no deal," I said, "there's only what's recorded." That was when Detective Holt stepped forward from the back of the room. And the temperature changed for everyone who'd come expecting a quiet country while reading. She introduced herself and her partner, calm and clear, and she said that the matter before the family was not only an estate, that there was an open investigation into the financial exploitation of Iris Dennison, and that some present might wish to speak with their own attorneys before saying anything further. She didn't slap cuffs on anybody. Real life is slower and heavier than television. But she laid the certified bank statements on the table next to my father's deed. And she said, looking at no one in particular, that they'd recently confirmed a key date with a witness who'd been in the house the night the pattern began. Every head in the room understood whose date that was. My mother's mouth opened and shut. Kyle was already halfway out the door. Holt's partner went out after him, unhurried. And Travis, my brother, who'd spent his whole life being told who I was, pushed off the wall by the window and stood in the middle of that room and said, to the neighbors and the pastor and our mother, the only words that mattered. "She told me Claire stole," he said, his voice unsteady. "My whole life, I never once saw any proof." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. He wasn't switching teams or asking for forgiveness. And I didn't expect him to. He was just a man who couldn't stand in his father's house and keep holding a lie that heavy. The pastor was on his feet now, the neighbors murmuring. The whole careful story my mother had spent 2 decades building, coming apart in front of the only audience she'd ever wanted to fool. Robert closed the folder. "That concludes the reading," he said. And in the silence after, with the alfalfa smell drifting in through the propped screen door and my father's name sitting on the table in black ink, I understood that I hadn't won anything back. You can't win back 22 years. But the truth was finally in the room. And it wasn't leaving with my mother's version anymore. People always want to know how it ended, in numbers. So here's what I can tell you, plainly and without dressing it up. The land was mine, free and clear, and nothing my mother filed afterward changed that. She did pursue her elective share as a surviving spouse, which the law allowed her, and she got a portion of the rest, and her lawyer made it slow and expensive, the way I was warned it would be. The county prosecutor referred Kyle's case forward. The financial exploitation matter is still grinding through the system as I tell you this, the way those things do, with no guarantees and a great deal of paper. I didn't get a tidy bow. What I got was the truth on the record and a ranch I never expected to want. I stayed 2 weeks past the funeral to deal with it all. And on the last evening, I walked the creek bottom by myself in the long gold light. 600 acres of second-cutting alfalfa my father had moved heaven and a courthouse to keep for me. I had his canvas work jacket on over my shirt, the one Ben pulled out of the box, and it still hung off me too big, the way his things always did. I sat on the tailgate at the edge of the field and read the last page of his letter one more time. The page he wrote near the end, where the pen shakes. He'd signed it, "Your father," who never once stopped. The grief didn't lift. I don't think it ever fully will. But sitting there in his jacket, on his land, with his words in my lap, I was, for the first time in 22 years, exactly where he'd always wanted me to be. Home, and safe. And finally, knowing it. I saw my mother one last time, the morning I left. Standing on that same porch where she'd branded me at 12. She started to say something about family, about how I'd regret cutting her off, about how I'd always been ungrateful. I didn't raise my voice. "You don't get to tell the story anymore," I said, "the records do." And then I walked down the steps. And for the first time in my whole life, I reached back and let that screen door close behind me. The way you close a door on a room you're never going to enter again. Some people love you out loud, with phone calls and birthdays and their arms around you. Mine loved me in silence, in paperwork, in 22 years of letting me hate him so that I would be far away and breathing. And I would trade every acre of that ranch for one more chance to hear his screen door close gentle behind him as he came in from the field. If this reminded you that the quiet ones are so often the people quietly protecting you, go call them today, while the only letters left are not the kind a lawyer hands you across a table. Share this with someone who needs it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.